Hooked on Classics. Ah yes. It was an album from the 1980s with an embarrassingly simple premise. You take a drum beat, nothing too fancy, just a kick and a snare, no fills, no breaks, just a rock-solid disco beat. Turn it up to a brisk 130 BPM, and then you rifle through the classical catalogue and cut out all the most memorable bits, the hooks. String them all together in a nice medley, bleeding chunks one after the other. As this is the 1980s, there's not much by way of digital warping or editing, so you hire yourself the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, who are frankly rather glad of the cash, and hey, you've got yourself an international smash hit and bestseller. So I was reminded of Hooked on Classics recently when Rob Ainsley, a journalist from BBC Music magazine, asked me for a quote for an article he was doing about the album, which is 40 years old this year. I could sense that Rob was having a hard time finding anyone willing to say anything positive about it. It's a pretty easy thing to be cynical about. Even as a 10-year-old, I think I could smell the whiff of fakery, the quick buck disguised as art. Then I asked my wife, and after a bit of rummaging in her parents' attic, she found this. It's a bootleg cassette of the album with details of each of those classical chunks meticulously handwritten on the cover. Growing up as she did in communist Poland, this was a prized possession from the West that her mum had smuggled over the border. You can imagine the border guards taking it out and putting it in the tape machine.
O Boże, na zachodzie jest gorzej niż myślałem.
And as for my wife, who was, all of 7 at the time, it was actually something of a formulative influence. It was her introduction to a lot of these classical tunes. And, she went on to train as a classical cellist. That's how we met studying at the Royal College of Music. So, Hooked on Classics may be the height of Western imperial decadence, but perhaps there's more educational value to it than we realise. And apart from that, as regular viewers of this channel know, there is something about adding a beat to a classical track which has fascinated me throughout my career, which I think may have been the reason that Rob got in touch in the first place. Well, we'll come back to my relationship to classics with a beat in a minute, but let's take a moment to look at how Hooked on Classics came to pass. And it all starts with one of these. It's a 45 RPM vinyl disc, a vinyl single, and these first came into existence in 1949, but they could only play about 3 minutes of music per side. The modern pop song was born with this invention, and of course it really caught on. By the mid-1970s there were no less than 200 million of these singles being sold every single year. And everyone was looking for their own way to cash in on the phenomenon, including the classical music industry. One of the first big successes was somewhat accidental. It came from synthesizer pioneer Wendy Carlos, whose 1968 album Switched on Bach featured full pieces by J.S. Bach performed on the newly invented Moog synthesizer, which Carlos had assisted in developing.
Wendy Carlos, in her studio in Greenwich Village, is one of the pioneers of synthesized sound. Her controversial versions of the classics, created entirely electronically, put machine-made music on the map.
Right now we're listening to the 8-track, and we're mixing, sort of playing the role of the conductor, putting together, in this case, a pair of tracks which has all of the string section that sounds like this. And there's this nice solo that's split up into 2 tracks. I think it needs a little more echo. Yeah, that's good.
The album was a surprise hit. It won Carlos 3 Grammys and it popularised the Moog itself as an instrument. Her record company Columbia wasn't expecting much by way of sales, so they offered her a low advance and a high royalty deal. The album topped the US classical charts for the next 3 years. Sadly, it's out of print and difficult to find online these days. Carlos is quite a reclusive character and refuses to let any of her music on streaming services or here on YouTube. She's not just an electronic music pioneer, but was also one of the first visible transgender artists in the US. The unexpected and, for her at the time, not particularly welcome limelight brought by the success of Switched on Bach may have been part of the reason for her retreat from public life. But if you want some flavour of the music, this recent act, The Art of Moog, pays homage to Wendy Carlos's works. also a number of rock and jazz-inspired takes on the classics. Dave Edmunds' version of Khachaturian's Sabre dance on blues guitar reached the UK's top 5. This is Emerson, Lake and Palmer's stadium rock version of Aaron Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man. And this is another story of the record company missing a trick. Apparently they initially refused the band permission to do this, before Copland himself overruled them. And my personal favourite, Eomir Deodato's jazz-funk version of Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra. This recent cover by Euro Groove Department is a pretty close replica to the original, and frankly, what's not to love? There were, however, some more cringe-inducing offerings. Waldo de los Rios' setting of Mozart's Symphony No. 40 features an electric guitar noodling somewhat pointlessly over the orchestra. And as this film shows, clearly comes from a time where women were not allowed near those dangerous musical instruments. The road that leads to Hooked on Classics itself starts with a salesman looking to make an easy buck. K-Tel as a company had its origins in Canada in the 1960s, hawking non-stick pans and Vegematic food slices.
Get Vegematic, the affordable food processor, now just $19.99 from K-Tel.
But founder Philip Kives spotted an easy buck to be made in the record market by relicensing existing hits and packaging them into compilations like 25 Great Country Artists Singing Their Original Hits or The Ultimate Rock and Roll Collection.
And today, the Ultimate Rock and Roll Collection can be yours. This is the only collection that packs 3 decades of music history into 10 CDs.
Now this is rock and roll. Now this is rock and roll.
By the 1970s, the company was a fully fledged record label, and one executive, Don Reedman, happened to attend a concert where he heard Walter Murphy's fantastically groovy disco reworking of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Also the height of disco, and Dutch production team Stars on 45 had just released a disco medley of Beatles hooks. He's a real nowhere man. And this gave Reedman an idea. What about a disco medley of classical hooks? So he scribbled down a list of popular themes, classical hooks used in TV ads, that, the classical memes of their day. And then he called up Louis Clark from the band The Electric Light Orchestra. Clark was a perfect choice for the job. He had a knowledge of both the pop world and the orchestral world. When Reedman called, he was just going into a session with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra to record the orchestra playing some classic rock tracks. He had the cunning idea to tag on the recording of the Hooked on Classics medley onto the end of the session.
This session booked. How about if we sneak this, if I can get it done in time, sneak this classical medley into the session. Well, we were in the studio and we did the ones I was supposed to be doing. Then we did became Hooked on Classics. Yeah. And we went right through it. And it was great, because every time we went from tune to tune, all the orchestra would, whoa!
The full album consisted not just of this up-tempo track, but the second track is a slow number, Hooked on Romance, with Bach's orchestral suite leading into Schubert's Ave Maria, leading into Liszt's Liebestrauma, and so on. And then it's a sort of suite of different composers, hooked on Bach, hooked on Tchaikovsky, hooked on Mozart. And some composers sit more comfortably in this environment than others. Obviously the cheesier end of the classical music, like say Offenbach's Can-Can, just feel right at home. For the musicians themselves, it seems to have been a bit of light-hearted fun, which most of them embraced. For the RPO, it represented a much-needed influx of cash, particularly when the success of the album led to follow-up recordings and tours. According to The Guardian, the project essentially rescued them from impending bankruptcy. So after Rob Ainsley spoke to me about the Hooked on Classics album for his article, it made me think more about the role this kind of classics with a beat approach has had in my life. Even as a kid, I remember picking up a guitar in a school orchestral rehearsal and turning Mozart's 40th into an instant reggae number. I think the teacher must have been out of the room at that point. And I have to admit, there's something I've always enjoyed about the cheekiness of slapping a drum beat onto a classical track. It instantly knocks any perceived stuffiness out of the music and reminds us that all different types of music really contain a lot of the same elements, just packaged slightly differently. To me, if there's a problem with Hooked on Classics, it's not so much the beat itself as that incredibly crude slapping together of one chunk after another, stripping the music of its context and meaning. But that's something that feels just as crude when it's done to, say, the Beatles. And anyway, maybe I'm wrong about that. I have a non-musical friend who tells me he loves Tchaikovsky, but why doesn't he just stick to the tunes? Why does he have all those tedious bits in between?
Hey, what happened to the tunes, man? More tunes! More tunes!
Maybe it's only people like me, people like most of you, I suspect, who spend too much time thinking about music that we can't enjoy the innocent pleasure of a good medley of all those fabulous hooks. So I jokingly said to Rob, maybe I should have a go at making my own updated version of Hooked on Classics. But after I spoke with him, I went back to Mozart's 40th and I spent a moment imagining the possibilities. Within about half an hour of playing around, I'd knocked up this version over a trap beat. You may have noticed it in the background a couple of videos back. So, I don't know, trapped classics, anyone? I mean, feel free to send me your trap versions of classical pieces and maybe we'll put together an album. I also did a little funk version of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring a while back.
Will it last a very long time this way? Will it last a very long time this way? Till the end, my dear.
And before that, a much more in-depth attempt to funk up a Bach partita with added drums and bass. Bach always seems to work best for these kind of ideas. It's the combination of the steady pulse, the rhythmic interplay, and just the amazing indestructible music that always seems to make it work. This kind of more intricate reimagining is much more my kind of thing. Here's another great example that my friends the Carducci Quartet did with drummer Christian Tamblay, Shostakovich's 7th String Quartet with added drums. I think I can summon all my musical and academic training to conclusively state,
now this is rock and roll.
Perhaps I should try the same approach with some of my own works. It would be pretty easy to add a beat to The Crazed Moon in the song cycle The North Wind Was a Woman. But the one I'd really like to hear is the stumbling rhythms of the third movement of my Lick Quartet, which I think could work really well with some, intricate drumming. Any takers? So let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. Is it sacrilegious destruction of these masterworks? Is it a bit of light-hearted fun? Or is it a fantastic introduction and educational tool to help people who don't know much about classical music get into it? I'll look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you as ever to my patrons on Patreon, and thanks to you for watching, and I'll see you next time.